I wasn't planning on making a video about The Night of the Generals. I wasn't even planning on watching The Night of the Generals. The film was a bit of a flop when it first came out in 1967, and it still isn't very highly regarded. This movie was directed by Anatol Litvak. I did a series about Litvak films on this channel a few months ago, but this movie didn't make the cut. It turns out that was a huge mistake and one that I'm really glad to rectify right now. I was actually on an airplane a couple weeks ago, and I found this movie on my hard drive and thought, hey, why not give it a chance? Usually, movies that I watch on a plane don't make a huge impression on me. Even though I've got nothing else to focus on, I'm always a bit distracted and a bit tired. And of course, these movies are usually the dregs, the things I haven't already watched. On top of that, I usually only watch like movies rated PG on a plane. I remember sitting next to someone watching The Wolf of Wall Street on a plane once. There were kids in the row behind us. I think that's a bit inconsiderate. I try not to do that. If possible, I like to watch movies that have subtitles so the person next to me can eavesdrop if they would like to. Anyway, this movie is an adaptation of a book by Hans Helmut Kirst, who seems like an extremely interesting person. Couldn't find tons of information about him. Again, weekly videos. I wish that I could just go on an absolute deep dive here and try to understand everything about this guy, read some of his books. Seems very interesting. Kirst was a Nazi. After the war, he became an author. I haven't read any of his books, but my impression is that they aren't the tragedies or the condemnations that many people might expect when reading books about Nazis. Instead, they're thrillers or satires about political grift, inside baseball about the German army. And to some extent, that's what this movie is. This is not Schindler's List. It's not a tragedy. And that might put some people off. But it makes room for another type of story with a lot of unexpected angles. Kirst wrote the book, but I think the movie has a life of its own. The screenplay was worked on by a bunch of people, Paul Dane among them, who was a real spy during World War II, another extremely interesting character. He would go on to adapt a number of spy novels for the screen, such as Goldfinger. Paul Dane, I think, brings some thrills to this movie. But the screenplay was also apparently worked on by Gore Vidal and my hero, Robert Anderson, neither of whom are credited. But if you know anything about either of those guys, it kind of makes sense that they worked on this movie. Gore Vidal lends the film a certain edge, and Robert Anderson gives it some maturity. Joseph Kessel is also credited for the adaptation. I don't know much about this guy. I guess he wrote the book that Belle de Jour is based on. He fought for the French during World War II alongside Romain Gary, although he was actually born in Argentina. So another really interesting character, and all around, a lot of interesting people involved with making this movie. You know, in the 60s, movies about World War II could be made by people who were actually there. That's not really true anymore. And it's interesting because I think in a lot of ways people kind of assume that movies are getting more sort of advanced as time goes on. Obviously, I don't really think that in some ways, but people might think with war movies in particular that we could make sort of a more technologically savvy, that we could make a larger scale, bigger, more accurate war movies today. But back in the day, in the 60s, we had people who were actually there, and so perhaps there is something pretty big that we've lost. Anyway, like I said, this movie was directed by Anatol Litvak. He was selected as the director apparently because he happened to own the rights to the book. I think in 67 he was already viewed as sort of an older, more old school director, but he had the rights, so he got the job, and he ended up being a fantastic fit for the material. I've covered a number of Anatol Litvak films in the past. Like I said, he knows how to handle mature material. He also knows how to handle a story with a big scale, not in-your-face scale. I really like this about Litvak's movies, like Anastasia, which I reviewed here. Doesn't throw set pieces in your face, which a lot of movies about Russia from that era try to do. But it's just kind of a scale. It's just kind of it gives you the feeling that no matter where the camera turns, the world would be there, and it would be authentic and big and there for you to see it. Like I said, he can handle scale. He also goes for a lot of ambitious, interesting techniques and styles. This movie does feature a number of whip pans. Don't worry. There's also a lot of great ensemble staging. But I think the most important thing about Litvak and this movie is that he has a lot of experience making movies about the old and new worlds, particularly the European old and new world. I have, again, on Nostalgia, reviewed that. Hugely nostalgic film, really about a search for a certain old world Europe, or maybe through a certain old world Europe that is on the verge of disappearing, trying to solve a mystery where nobody quite remembers the clues. This movie, very similar in some ways. In this film, most of the action takes place during World War II, but the story goes beyond that to after the war, where people are looking back. This becomes kind of a crucial frame for the movie. I'll come back to this, but I guess what I should say here is that if you really know all the people who are involved here in making this movie, it's no surprise that it turned out the way it did, and it's no surprise that it's good. Okay. So this movie starts out with the murder of a prostitute in occupied Warsaw. It turns out that the prostitute was a German agent. There was one witness, Polish citizen, who sees the murderer through a crack in the door, and what he sees is that the murderer has a general's uniform. A German officer, Major Grau, is assigned to investigate. Omar Sharif plays Grau and gives him a certain distinction. Now, like I said, this isn't your usual Nazi movie, and to some people, it might seem a bit absurd that the German army would investigate a murder at all, that they would care. This might have been one of the sticking points when the movie was first released. Why do we have a Nazi hero anyway? Why do we have a Nazi with distinction? Why do we have a good guy in the German army? Seems a bit odd. I think there's a number of different things to think about here. My goal isn't really to justify that the plot is realistic, but just to show that the plot is interesting, and I think a good way to structure the movie. First of all, the movie does quite a bit to show us how the German army cares about law and order, right? Which in some ways shouldn't be that much of a surprise. The catch, of course, is that it's their law and their order. The Nazis often appealed to justice to justify their policies. You know, doesn't seem like it's necessarily that absurd that they would also investigate crimes and try to uphold the sanctity of the law. And remember, the prostitute was a German agent, not a random Polish citizen. The second thing is that it's clear from the beginning that the investigation may or may not go anywhere. People might say, yeah, right, the Nazis would never investigate their own generals. And this is kind of the point the movie is making, too. Major Grau doesn't have much luck talking to the generals. He doesn't have much luck making people care. In fact, one of his few allies in his investigation ends up being in the French underground. Not a spoiler, don't worry. Let me rephrase that. Not to say it turns out that the ally is in the French underground, but it turns out that someone in the French underground is one of the few people that he can ally with. Okay. Something that we see with this, I think, is that there's a lot of different pieces to the machine, a lot of different people. In some World War II movies, the German army, the SS, the Gestapo, these are all morphed together into one thing. Maybe there's some different uniforms here and there, but you don't really need to worry about why they're different or how. But in reality, people had different angles, different allegiances, different goals, different backgrounds, different histories. You know, people were different. And this is something that the Night of the Generals reminds us of constantly. Like I said, it's kind of jarring maybe to some people, the perspective it gives us, but by not being a tragedy, we see some things we wouldn't see otherwise. Is it weird that we're following Major Grau basically as a hero? Yeah, it kind of is. I guess in some ways this movie poses a similar question to something like Judgment at Nuremberg. Where is the boundary between individuals and organizations? In some ways it feels like we're crossing a line, like it's some sort of taboo to think about those questions, to entertain the fact that maybe there was a good guy around. The final thing about this murder plot line is that while it is in some ways the main plot of the movie, it really isn't. Instead, the murder plot kind of gives us an entry point, is kind of an entry point for the movie to give us a guided tour of World War II, of the German army, of politics, of power, how individuals wielded power, how the system and the circumstances allowed certain individuals to come to power, how the system and the circumstances defined what justice meant, what crimes mattered, what people got away with. These questions strike at the core of how society is structured. And really, I think that's what this movie is about. On the surface, the story is just that German society was broken. But I think the insights go much deeper than that. In this movie, we see a bunch of different historical contexts. We see how crime and justice meant different things through those times. So like I said, Major Grau tries to investigate this murder. It turns out that there are 3 generals in Warsaw, and they'll become some of the main characters of the movie. This film wanders around a lot, by the way. Beyond just being set in 3 different times and 3 different locations, we have quite a few characters, and in different parts of the movie, different characters take the lead, take the focus. These shifts are probably both a strength and a weakness. The 3 generals are played by Peter O'Toole, Donald Pleasence, and Charles Gray. Interestingly, Donald Pleasence and Charles Gray have both played Blofeld in James Bond movies, not at the same time, though. A large portion of this movie is a character study of the 3 generals here. To some extent, these generals might represent different types of leaders, different facets of the German army, different facets of humanity, different insecurities and weaknesses that people have. General Tons, this is Peter O'Toole, is a hotshot. He comes to Warsaw with Hitler's blessing and immediately tries to stamp his image into the city. He's ambitious. Tons is exacting, too. He's completely unflinching when it comes to what he thinks is right. Usually, it isn't right, but he does have principles. While touring Warsaw, for instance, he encounters some starving children, and he orders his troops to feed them. He orders his troops to bring extra rations whenever they're patrolling in the future and to give them to the children. It's easy to feed the children. It's easy to help them, he said, something like that. Later on, he orders his men to torch the buildings of Warsaw and shoot anyone who flees. Tons is really an interesting character. And honestly, I think this might be my favorite Peter O'Toole role ever. Okay, I've never been a huge fan of Lawrence of Arabia, as you'll know if you've followed this channel for a while. That's obviously his big role, but man, he is really good here. In general, all of the character studies in this movie really come off. I think sometimes I'm not inherently interested in a movie that's a character study, right? And maybe this is what the last movie I reviewed, Under the Volcano, maybe this is one of the reasons why it didn't sink its teeth into me quite as much, because it's a great character study, but, you know, what else is it? What's the point? Why are these characters salient or interesting? Or how are they surprising and different? This movie doesn't suffer from that at all. Almost every character you see in here, it's like, yeah, I want to learn more about this. I want to see what makes them tick, understand them, see all the little twists and wrinkles of their personality, learn about their background, and see where they're headed in the future. Peter O'Toole, no different, and man, what a magnetic role here. Peter O'Toole, very interesting actor, had a reputation as a heavy drinker. This is something that some people admire him for, his roguish, unashamed streak. You combine this with his sharp tongue, some dry wit, and you get someone that a lot of people can latch onto, someone that seems very prestigious. Celebrity lushes of the 60s and 70s, very interesting topic, especially given last week's movie too. We're not really going to get into it more. Suffice to say, I'm not exactly a Peter O'Toole fanboy. I'm not totally sure how I feel about him, but he is great in this movie. Tons of range. Ton starts out as this intense, exacting, intimidating character, but as the movie goes on, we see that there's a lot more to him, things you wouldn't expect. The other 2 generals are more bureaucratic. One is a bit withdrawn, but perhaps is hiding something, and the other is just trying to go with the flow and ride things out. Each of them conniving in their own ways, each of them extremely weak and annoying in their own ways. Presumably one of them murdered the prostitute. You'll have to watch the movie to find out who, or indeed to find out if we find out. We're also introduced to a young corporal in this movie, played by Tom Courtenay, who was in Dr. Zhivago and The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, 2 great movies. And the corporal's a great character. He's involved in a romantic subplot that's actually very strong, and I don't always say that about romantic subplots, but this one is great, really snappy dialogue. In addition to these three generals, we also get three different settings. So the movie opens in Warsaw in 1942, as I've kind of alluded to, depicting, I guess, Operation Barbarossa. This is where we see violence perpetrated by the German army. This movie doesn't mention the Holocaust at all, and maybe it does feel a bit toothless or out of touch in some ways, but some of the scenes in Warsaw help with this, I think. It reminds me a bit of the film Judgment at Nuremberg, where most of the movie takes place in a courtroom, is very sterile, disconnected from the people on the ground. But about 2/3 of the way through the movie, as part of the evidence, we see footage from the liberation of the camps, and this completely shifts the movie into another gear. Really makes the movie tick, I think. This movie isn't that extreme, but seeing that violence in Warsaw does galvanize things in a similar way, and it shows us another side of General Tanz. There's a German reporter making a radio broadcast from the field as this is happening. General Tanz is being filmed. Interesting little detail thinking about how media were on the battlefield. We have a long history of Hollywood directors, Hollywood actors helping out to bring a certain vision of World War II to American viewers, but Germans were doing something similar as well. At first, you don't maybe realize that the movie's going to jump around as much as it does, but the section in Warsaw comes to kind of an abrupt end, and then we pick things up again in Paris in 1944. Actually, before we get there, we make a stop in the 60s after the war, where some people are looking back at the case. At first, this frame seems pretty minimal, even superfluous maybe, but it becomes a big part of the movie later on. Paris in 1944 is quite different from Warsaw in 1942. Paris is an open city, and officers spend a fair amount of time exploring it, taking in the culture. Again, interesting little angle. When I was younger, I imagined that in wartime everything would just stop. No one would go to work, no one would go to school in the bunker 24/7 or something. I don't know exactly what I thought. It's true to some extent, I suppose, but at the same time, people really find a way to go on with their lives. I was thinking about this a lot during a certain global pandemic. People find a way to go on. In this movie, we see life going on in Warsaw, and we see life really carrying on in Paris. Another interesting thing is that in 1944, among the generals, there's doubt and uncertainty. It seems like they don't all believe that they're going to win the war. This is another angle that you don't see in a lot of World War II movies that often. Anyway, it turns out that Major Grau, the three generals, and the corporal all are in Paris in 1944. The movie picks up again there, and the investigation of the murder actually gets back into gear as well. Grau thinks, hey, maybe I can finally figure it out. Really, we spend most of this section focused on other things. We meet Philippe Noiret, for instance, who plays Toto in Cinema Paradiso. This movie has some really interesting twists in it, and I don't really want to spoil them, so I won't go any further with the plot. But I do want to talk a little bit about the last section, which takes place after the war. Suffice to say, regarding the plot, that this movie was way more engaging than I had expected. It's a somewhat long movie, I think 2 hours, 40 minutes, something like that. And, I was sort of watching it to pass the time on the plane, but I found myself leaning in more and more throughout the movie and actually becoming quite curious about the characters, quite engaged in the characters, and also wondering if the murder would be found and who it is, how things would play out. A really well-balanced movie with very interesting history, a lot of classy, I don't really like that word, but I think here it fits, classy style, dialogue, snappy, but that also has some deeper themes to it. Yeah, great movie. Anyway, after the war, we meet the generals again, this time as private citizens. A lot of post-war films about World War II give you the impression that all Nazis, everyone who had been in the German army, was hunted down after the war. If you've seen The Stranger, if you've seen The Boys from Brazil, or The Man in the Glass Booth, you'd think that everyone was in hiding in South America or something, on the run from the Mossad. But again, it turns out that reality is complicated. And I guess there were former generals who did get on with their lives. Some maybe served prison sentences, but, were released, and then sort of carried on with things, picked up, made a new life. In some ways, the thing that's most interesting about a tragedy, about an unspeakable, tragedy, is the things that happen afterwards, because it's never the end of the story. The story never ends, Again, we get a perspective in this movie that you don't get in a whole lot of other films. Or, maybe you know this already, and you just think I have no clue about history. You might be right. I talked a bit about this framing mechanism earlier. The film, I think, kind of modulates when we realize that all this stuff happened in the past. There's a big difference between a thriller or some sort of murder mystery where the big question is what's going to happen next. And on the other hand, a movie where we know a bit about the ending and we're trying to figure out what happened. Both cases might be suspenseful, but the information that we have is a bit different, and usually the tone is a bit different. Of course, this is a historical film, and historical films maybe always fall into that second category where we know the ending, either because the ending is now or because the ending is some well-known historical event. I think what the frame in this movie gives us is some insight into history itself, into the process of looking back, picking up a story that is hidden by time. Or in other words, trying to understand what the heck happened. And in the 60s, I think a lot of people were trying to understand what happened during the war. Were trying to understand their own memories and their own feelings. What a process. What a process that is. The opening credits of this movie show us glimpses of a general's uniform. This is evoking that view the witness has of the suspect fleeing the scene, the view through a crack in a door. And at first it doesn't seem that significant. But when we see these generals after the war, and we eventually get to the closing credits where we see the shards again, they seem to carry a lot more weight. These icons and insignia were huge, were powerful, were part of this crazy system that for a while had control. There's something about the title, too, The Night of the Generals, that evokes this moment where these things had power. The movie takes us to a reunion of one of the divisions that we see in the earlier sections, a reunion after the war. They have banners and signs, but they don't have any uniforms, and they don't have any icons. No crosses, no swastikas. Sort of neutered in some ways. The censored version, the secular version. One of the officials speaks. He recalls the good old days when, as he says, they had something they could truly believe in. Nostalgia for those times. Clearly, they haven't gotten over the change in circumstances. They're still attached to their former authority in some way, to some kind of nostalgia, but they don't have the uniforms anymore. And just like the more positive characters in the film are trying to go back and unravel this mystery, trying to understand what happened, trying to understand why things the way they were. The negative characters, are doing exactly the same thing, trying to make sense of just how everything changed. And so, yeah, like I said, I think this frame really recasts the movie, even though we don't actually spend that much time in the 60s. It really changes our view from this being kind of a story about the events of the 40s to being a story about history and about processing the events of the 40s or something like that. I mean, maybe that's overstating it, but that was the feeling that I had. Overall, this is clearly a substantial movie. It's got great acting. I mean, the cast is awesome. It's really well directed. I haven't really talked about many individual moments, but like I said, there's just a lot of clever little things, great dialogue, and, the movie's quite engaging. All kinds of interesting twists and pivots, but substantive too. So, like I said, big mistake from me first time around not to watch The Night of the Generals, and I strongly recommend it, especially if you're kind of into the historical film. This is a great example.